Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. Today, I'm being joined by Mmabatho Montse from Africa, and we're going to learn about her work. And I love the title that she thought up here, Education is Awareness. I think that's going to be a great umbrella for looking at the nuts and bolts of the work that she is doing. So before we get introduced to Mmabatho, just one announcement with Apocatastasis, and that is an invitation to check out our books. Right now, in the big picture, we're slowly but surely building up for a campus here in Connecticut. And part of that work is income, monetary income. So right now, and indeed over the semester, you're going to see a lot coming out from Apocatastasis Press. And that's a great way to support us all together. Down below, besides our website, we'll also have Mmabatho's, which right now I'm pulling up on the screen here. It's very well designed, very sleek, and very informative altogether. So as I'm doing that, Mmabatho, welcome all together. Hope you're doing well. Let us know a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much, John, for inviting me on your podcast. As you have mentioned, I am Mmabatho Montse. I'm an independent scholar practitioner based in South Africa. My journey with education has been quite long and interesting. However, the past, I can say 5 years through my initiation have made me even more aware of what education can be and what it currently is not, and how education was used as an instrument here in Africa to colonize in different ways, whether it was through research, anthropologists, missionaries coming to Africa, extracting information, and a lot of that information about us being used for our oppression. And so my journey and passion for education is really about how we can use education as an instrument to create a better world, to ensure that human beings can live in harmony with the rest of nature. And a lot of that is founded on my own African ontology that holds that all of life is interconnected. And so everything I do really comes from that place of interconnectedness of all of life, including nature.
Thank you very much for that. Now, you mentioned in your opening remarks here initiation, and could you elaborate a little bit about that? You said, this consciousness of education since your initiation. By what do you mean with that expression?
So I've been initiated into Nguni traditions of Ubungoma, what you might otherwise know as shamanism. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was an initiated traditional healer, and so was her grandmother. And so I come from a lineage, a matrilineal lineage of healers. And so through that initiation, getting to understand the underworld, getting to understand ancestors, and commune with them in more deliberate ways and in more ways that I'm aware, because I think our ancestors are always with us. A lot of the time, we are not aware of that fact. And when I speak about ancestors, I speak about our relations with nature. And so in African contexts, mountains, rivers, animals are part of our families. You'll find that in most African traditions, people have what they call praise names, which basically tell a story about your lineage. And it tends to reveal the greater than human lives that form part of our relations and kinship. And so, since my understanding of that, I find that my education is increasingly concerned with the polycrisis we find ourselves in. And for as long as we are not aware of how we are connected with the rest of the life we share the planet with, then it will be very difficult for humanity to respond effectively to the polycrisis.
Thank you for illuminating that. And I see on your about statement here on your beautiful website, up here you have the expression of transdisciplinary spiritual decolonial practitioner. And that's it's a mouthful, but it does obviously encompass where you're coming from, as did your illustration just now of that so-called shamanic, or whatever the proper terminology is. So different, I think, as you're laying out your work, and we're getting to know your vision, Mmabatho. So different, even some of these points about lineage and connection, and you even mentioned the polycrises, which we might want to define momentarily. But all of it so very different here in North America, and just in the general Western educational paradigm. I'm thinking we have such a mechanistic understanding. For some reason, the past couple of days in this conversation in different of my classes, I've been really annoyed by Newtonian overreach. This Newtonian idea of a mechanical universe, and how that has completely infiltrated, and this mechanistic language, and also very, very materialistic language, is misapplied to so many aspects of life, including education. And so here we are. I reckon there's probably a similarity with time spent in school in mainstream schools. But here we are in North America. People spend all this time in school to quote unquote get a job. And you mentioned something vital, and I'm going to ask you to elaborate on this, and that's the poly crisis. Most people wouldn't even understand the different crises that are happening and that affect them. Our consciousness, so-called, in education is so low. All we're concerned about is some materialistic so-called success, completely removed and boiled down and excised from a larger tapestry of life. So any thoughts on those points? And in particular, if you could define the polycrises, Mmabatho.
Mm. I mean, John, when you begin by understanding why it is that we live in such a mechanistic reality, you easily get to the conclusion that the overemphasis of patriarchy or the masculine through the ages is much of what has formed the way we relate as human beings. So whether it is capitalism, which is really based on extraction, on competition, um, and a very mechanistic way of thinking and doing about things, very linear, you can easily see that that is connected to patriarchy. And when one thinks about patriarchy, one can easily take it back to religion and the early formations of Western Christianity. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because we can also, through this lens, have a better understanding of how the sacred has been removed from everyday life. So from people, everyday people recognizing that they have spirit living in them and therefore they are sacred. Or even to take it a step forward, to see how nature, which is a feminine principle, or the feminine herself, has been removed from how civilization or this particular I think how imperial societies have functioned. So the feminine has been suppressed a lot. With the feminine comes compassion, comes nurturing, comes creativity, comes intuition. And if one thinks about what intuition is, one can attribute it to having a gut feeling. So a feeling that is beyond just your five senses, a particular way of knowing that has been taken away from mainstream education, because I think through particular religions, particularly Abrahamic religions, which centered to the forefathers mostly, the feminine has been dominated, the feminine has been erased, and as a result, that is why we see that everything has been mechanized, because the masculine mindset, which is very rational, which is very much in your mind, what people might think of as the brain, it thinks in a particular way, it's survivalist, it's competitive. And that is not to say there is anything wrong with the masculine inherently. However, when it is out of balance, it then causes a lot of destruction. And that is why I believe we need the feminine energy to complement the masculine and to create balance. And so when there is the feminine within education, we'll find that education becomes more creative, education becomes more relational. Education slows down a bit the pace, because it's not about what you can prove necessarily, which is what the Western sciences have been about, what you can measure and what you can prove with your eyes, and so on. So from that perspective, one can then take it a notch further to then look at what the polycrisis is. We basically, as humanity, find ourselves at a interlocking place where inequality, ecological breakdown are all happening at the same time. And one has to think about the root cause of inequality, of violence, of ecological destruction. It is mostly as a result of capitalism. an extractive mindset that just takes without consideration of the future. And so I believe by taking up a more feminine approach to education, by lifting the feminine, industries like care, for example, working with nature. You'll remember that there was a time in history when women who were considered witches, going back to initiation, women who were who had a closer relationship with nature, women who could hear, they were called witches, and many of them were killed. Their tongues were cut off because they knew something more than what the mainstream people knew, right? And because they were more spirited, they were more in tune with their spirituality. And that is why they were oppressed and taken out, basically. And so when we think about that, connecting it to shamanic ways of knowing or indigenous ways of knowing, which center the interconnectedness of all of life, then you'll see that if there is an approach we took up, then we'll be able to effectively respond to some of the crises we find ourselves in as humanity.
I'm very interested in history and recent history and social dynamics and things. And, you know, here in Connecticut, this is also a colonial project. We don't think of it here as such. Unlike Africa, the people who came here and effectively wiped out the original inhabitants. And so you mentioned, coming from these African roots and these more this tribal consciousness. What has, in the past couple of decades, Mmabatho, what has that revival, that cultural consciousness looked like? There are Indian tribes, so-called, in Connecticut, but they're very scattered and whatnot. That's a whole other discussion to really deal with that in its appropriate sensitivity. But they were effectively wiped out culturally. And what they're doing, almost like the Jews, is trying to recreate something they've lost, something they don't have a living memory of. In America, the natives, many of them, especially in the East Coast, we don't. Long story short, is what I'm saying. When it comes to cultural traditions, we don't really have a contrast. We have this mono-colonial culture here. In Africa, happily, the colonization, as brutal as it was not as total in certain respects. So these African tribes are somewhat more holistically, they've kept their culture as a living thing in a way that many of the tribes here haven't. So my question is, in the past few decades, to go back as far as you please, how has that cultural revival, renewal looked? And also, I think appropriate to that question of a historical analysis explanation, maybe we could also ask, and I could restate this if you need, what does this type of education practically look like in the classroom? These are, I think, two questions that are related, and I can rephrase them to remind you if you need as we go.
Yeah. So I think that, and I believe that inherently all human beings know their true nature. And our true nature as humanity is that we are nature beings. We share the same animating force with plants and animals, with oceans and rivers. And so we are a part of nature. And I believe that we have been denatured through our social conditioning that has happened in various ways. Of course, some people have been more affected by it than others. But fundamentally, I believe all human beings have got the capacity to connect with nature because we all come from the same source. And then my research on epigenetics and ancestral trauma. So post my initiation, I then embarked on scientific research to understand what happens when I can hear my ancestors speaking to me, and I have these dreams that are so vivid and they are so alive. And when I go into a trance, I wanted to understand what happens to me. And so I started doing research. And through my research, I came across the study of epigenetics, which is the study of nature and nurture, and how our environment and how we've been nurtured influences who we become. And this particular field of epigenetics confirms what my ancestors have known, which is to say we inherit our ancestors' memories. Now, epigenetics go as far as saying we inherit 5 to 7 generations of
Mm,
memory through our genes, right? So this confirms, or it connects back to what I said just a few moments ago, to say I believe we all have our ancestral ways, because the memory lives through our genes. Of course, it does take quite a bit of time to get through our own conditioning in order to retrieve this memory. In my work, I've dubbed it metaphysical memory transmission, which requires an effort from the person who's trying to remember, but also just to say these memories are accessible to us if we want to have access to them. And what I love about my work is that the more connected we feel with nature, the more we are able to increase the vital energy that animates us. And when we are able to strengthen this vital energy within ourselves, then we become more connected with nature, meaning we are able to perceive more, meaning our ordinary senses become heightened, and therefore we are able to perceive what ordinarily other people might not be able to perceive. And that for me is what spirituality means a lot. Our ability to live within this liminal space, our ability to perceive beyond 3 dimensions, which is very important for our own connectedness with the rest of life. How this connects to education, I think we can all agree that recent history is demonstrating that in as much as science has advanced in a lot of ways, the amount of knowledge that has been produced has not made us more intelligent as the human species, right? Because if we were intelligent, then we would not destroy our own and only home. And so my work in researching my ancestral ways has taught me that my ancestors were actually so much more intelligent because they had a very complex way of understanding themselves in relation to the rest of creation. I mean, if you are able to understand your interdependence on with rivers, with other animals, then you have a complex mind. You are able to cross boundaries. And I think the loss of that ability to perceive at a complex level has dumbed down people. And so we need to increase our levels of intelligence, which connects to education. For me, education is being able to think across complex systems, being able to integrate knowledge. You'll note that many of philosophers, artists, like even Leonardo
mm,
da Vinci, they had the ability to bring together complex knowledge systems and create something beautiful out of them. Many of them were multi-talented. There were people who could work across disciplines and create beautiful, forward-thinking work. And so I believe if through education we are able to have transdisciplinary ways of knowing, meaning bringing different disciplines of knowledge together to have an integrated view of the world or our experience in the world, then it would make us more intelligent.
Thank you for that breakdown. Very thorough altogether there. And it's interesting. I have a knowledge of Western pedagogy going back a ways, and Western culture, and I would say even through the Second World War, um, it wasn't just educationally, but also, informally in classrooms and all of this, but as a cultural zeitgeist or cultural fumes in the air, uh, we too had in the West here in North America, and you can tell this just by reading the books, listening to people talking, a very backwards looking, and I don't mean that in any pejorative sense. It's very interesting, in fact, that term backwards has a pejorative connotation, in fact. But if you listen to the speeches and the references and just the conversations that are recorded prior, we'll say, to the Second World War, there are constant references to the classical world, constant references to events in history, and some of that was because of the nature of the education. They were hand in glove. And then since the war, certainly, in the West, and probably in up until quite recently in South Africa too, the education is so driven towards the future and to cutting off bonds, not just bonds of lineage, but these cultural and historical connections. And my question for you, Mmabatho, is presumably, and maybe you could flesh this out, the nature of the school systems in South Africa. But I would imagine the mainstream school systems are pretty standard as what you would get in Europe or North America in terms of what a school day looks like. But when you're bringing your vision to, to the public and to students of various ages, where do you start? I mean, the modern system, I believe, through no conscious fault of the people staffing it. Most people, like most things in life, don't actually really think about the ramifications or the spirituality or the energies that are behind it. People are trying to get through the day, and that's just as true in the schools. So, I'm not. I'm going to say something critical, but I'm not critiquing the teachers or the staff, much less the students or the parents in these modern schools, so-called. But it is very obvious to me that modern so-called education is meant to cut off these bonds. And we could even take this back to discussions about birth practices all the way through early childhood. I mean, if you really lay this stuff out, it's very obvious to me. It's meant to numb any sort of these deeper connections that you so beautifully laid out for us. But my question
Yeah.
is, again, when you're bringing it to people who don't know their nose from their elbow, with this part of life, it's numb to them. It's a muscle that has never been exercised because of their training through no fault of their own. Where do you start, Mmabatho?
So, it was until recent years that it clicked to me that education is largely about ideas. And ideas are what inform the world. Ideas have the power to create realities. Ideas are what makes the world go around, right? And I think the fact that most learners, most students do not recognize that the power of education is in its power to solidify ideas. And ideas are what make up reality. Ideas are what holds power in place, right? Ideas are what make certain people respond to certain things in a particular way. And so once we understand that education is largely informed by ideas, we then get to understand that ideas or education is what forms a particular narrative. And when one thinks about what a narrative is, it's basically a story about what is and what was. And so through the power of education, there is a particular narrative that the world is operating through. And this narrative might be that we need capitalism. This narrative might be that we need hierarchy. This narrative might be that race matters. This narrative might be that human beings, male, white, are the most powerful in the world and have got the authority over all forms of life. So that is what education is, because it forms ideas. It is what influences narratives and what people buy into. And so the fact that many people, the majority of the world, ordinary people, as we might call them for the purpose of this conversation, are not aware of the power of education and how education can be used as an instrument, it means that the people who have come up with this particular narrative that we currently have running the world have made sure that the people, the foot soldiers, which is ordinary people, the workers, the middle class, the poor, have bought into a particular idea to say this is just how things are. Now, if teachers in particular believe that the world as we know it, as we are experiencing it today, is just how things are, then we have a big problem, because we then don't have teachers who are able to help students become critical thinkers. Because I believe being a critical thinker is being able to question things, why things function in a particular way, and coming up with your own perspectives around how else they could function. So when we don't have critical thinkers, it means that, as we are seeing in the United States now, everything that has to do with Black history, they will try to erase it because they do not want a competing narrative. You know, it goes back to why history or the dominant system is so forward thinking. Because at every age or era in history, when there is a global upheaval or where there are opportunities to change the way things function, these systems obviously recognize that, and they want to make sure that they hold on to their power, which is held within a particular narrative. And that means erasing history or distorting history so that history or what can be found in history can support the narrative they are trying to push.
Yes, certainly in these United States, the ruling class, or the misruling class, as the case is, they have a PhD in setting people against each other. It's amazing how they'll do this. And this is, you know, it's as old as the hills, divide and conquer, and how the people, and this is throughout the world, of course, but in this country, how the so-called masters of this society set people. You mentioned the Black History Month in February here, as of recording February, you know, becomes controversial, and how the the people who are setting people against each other are so adept at this. And part of this is the nature of modern schooling, especially, I believe, certainly since the Second World War, and these trends have greatly picked up the pace, is that one of the lessons, the problem, I think, of these modern systems of education are the unwritten things. Those are where the real damage is done. It's not on, necessarily false material that's explicitly being taught. It's the stuff between the lines. And I bring two things to your attention, Mmabatho, and perhaps you can bring your insights to these points. In modern pedagogy, the original sin of it, I believe, is the breaking of bonds. And that's in literally how the day is organized, where the month and the year and the students' curricula from the young child to the young man, young woman, and that is constantly breaking bonds. Right, we're going to study this now. Mmabatho is going to teach us this for 45 minutes, and now we're going to do mathematics for 45 minutes, and now we're going to do this for 45 minutes. Now we're going to eat lunch for 45 minutes, whatever, and keep doing. And these sciences are taught with no connection to each other whatsoever, and the instructors have only a superficial connection, and one knowing what the other is actually teaching. That's constantly being changed year to year to year to year. And so you produce someone, on top of other social trends beyond our discussion, who has no integration of sciences, of different human sciences. I don't just mean natural science. Their entire world of knowledge is shattered. And that's, I believe, very deliberate, to disempower the person, because it isolates them intellectually, and it also isolates who they perceive they are in this world. They've been broken up. The second sin, so-called, of modern education, I believe. Well, the second point, Mmabatho, I forget for the moment. It'll come to me. But perhaps you will speak to the first point there about the breaking up of unified consciousness in modern educational paradigms.
And I mean, it goes back to what I shared earlier around why transdisciplinary education is important, and why I believe that once we understand ourselves as spiritual beings, then we are able to have this interconnected or integrated understanding of who we are. I think if, first and foremost, individuals do not see themselves as a body that is made up of bodies, because when you think about the nervous system and the thousands, if not millions, of organisms that work independently and interdependently to ensure that one has a healthy functioning body, you'd be amazed, right? And when we understand how food nourishes our bodies for optimal performance, how air nourishes us for our oxygen regulation and just optimum health, just these different things that we rely on without cognitively thinking about them, that work together to ensure that our bodies function in a healthy way, then it would be silly to think that our existence in the world should be anything different. I think a healthy human being, an educated human being, is an intelligent human being. And I think intelligence really has to do with the ability to think across complex, interconnected systems, our ability to live within that complexity. Once we want to make everything the same, homogeneous, once we want to reproduce our sameness in other people, then that makes us unintelligent, because it means we require less to exist. We require less resource. We require less faculties, because when you're doing the same thing every day, you no longer at some point use your mind, because it becomes automatic, right? And that automation can be linked to the age of technology, where everything is becoming so mechanized and everything is, technology and so on. So whilst technology has got its benefits, but I believe losing our ability to make sense across different disciplines and bring them together to create a holistic worldview, I think that is so important. And I also think it's important in our ability to see ourselves as connected with nature. You just have to go outside. If you are fortunate enough to live in the rural side of your town or your city, you'll see just how much diversity there is in nature, and yet how much everything needs the other in order to survive, right? So to think of human beings or as human education as something different, I think it is making us less intelligent. It is making us unresponsive to life. For a very long time, we've been speaking about the earth as the only, focus, but now with planetary consciousness, we begin to consider other planets. But how do we get to planetary consciousness when we fail to understand and to live with the difference amongst human beings and with other animals or species that we share the earth with?
Now, as you were talking there, Mmabatho, you and everyone else saw me looking over my shoulder. And the reason I was doing that was to see if I could get my hands on a document we published at ApocatastasisInstitute Press, and that is Patrick Pearce's Murder Machine from 1913, I believe, right before the First War. And he's talking about the English educational system in Ireland, another colonial project. And like a lot of critiques of education, it's amazing how far, what we call education nowadays, it's amazing how far people back in history have been talking about the problems with this. And you bring up very appropriately, and I think we're very much on the same wavelength here with this mechanistic Newtonian misunderstanding of the human being and of society. I thought of this quote, and so I cannot get my hands on the physical copy, but thankfully we have these PDFs at easy access. So I'm going to read this and pick your mind on it, Mmabatho. Patrick Pearce says, Murder Machine. One of the most terrible things about the English education system in Ireland is its ruthlessness. I know no image for that ruthlessness in the natural order. The ruthlessness of a wild beast has in it a certain mercy. It slays. It has in it a certain grandeur of animal force. But this ruthlessness is literally without pity and without passion. It is cold and mechanical, like the ruthlessness of an immensely powerful engine. A machine, vast, complicated, and a multitude of far-reaching arms, many ponderous presses, carrying out this is the education system he's talking about, mysterious and long-term processes of shaping and molding. It is the true image of the Irish education system. It grinds night and day. It obeys immutable and predetermined laws. It is as devoid of understanding, of sympathy, of imagination, as is any other piece of machinery that performs an appointed task. Into it is fed all the raw human material in Ireland. It seizes upon it inexorably, and rends and compresses and remolds. And what it cannot refashion after the regulation pattern, it ejects with all likeness of its former self, crushed from it, a bruised and shapeless thing, thereafter accounted waste.
Very true indeed. And I think for me at least, it reminds me of our earlier parts of our conversation where we spoke about the masculine when it is in overdrive. When you think about what the masculine principle represents, so, they speak about this merciless animal that just preys and takes and it slays. So when one thinks about the survivalist components of the masculine energy, the hunter, I think I also feel drawn to also think about how the mind is understood within spiritual sort of like spaces, to say a mind, in as much as it is a beautiful, for right now I'll use the word companion, but it's a horrible master. So if the mind, an untrained mind, I feel like it becomes this beast. And some people have said I'm not looking for the word serpent, but almost
Mm,
like that kind of a yeah, description where when you don't understand how the mind functions and how it can dominate all other senses, then we will not be able to understand the masculine principle in its distorted form, because I don't think a healthy masculine is the way the patriarchy has manifested itself, but I think a distorted version of it will definitely be in this way. And so when you think about who has been at the forefront of development, even in education, it's mostly been male thinkers. Anything, even from Western education, you look at Maria Montessori,
mm,
she's more on the, what's the word I'm looking for? She's not mainstream education,
mm.
so the dominant thinkers have been male in the educational, in the field of science. And that is why I think science has lost the ability to be more in tune with the rest of creation. Yeah, I hope that responds. But I completely agree with the text you read, and I'm sure it would be a very interesting article for me to read.
Yes, for yourself, Mmabatho, and for the audience, I will put that PDF link in the description. And before we get caught up on your output, whether it's your podcast or any publications you have, I did think in your response just now to bring things back to your own work. The text we looked at, the last word was waste, according to the author Patrick Pierce. The modern so-called education system uh, treats the student, the soul of the student, and the body of the student, for that matter, as waste to go and staff its factories and its McDonald's or whatever they replace the factories with now. Waste, waste, waste. Bringing things back to your work, Mmabatho, what has been the response from different people who've heard your programs, your storytelling, your podcast, students of whatever age, as young as you please, as old as you please, about the worth? The worth. We have an educational system which works hand in glove with a very disordered society to create, and this is very obvious to me on so many levels, discouraged people. And a lot of that discouragement to earlier parts of this conversation comes about by isolating the individual and who they are on this earth and what their life actually is in a larger tapestry. And that creates discouragement. And once you have people discouraged, they're fearful. To our mutual contact, Dr. Fisher, and that that focus on fear and fearlessness, it's easy to control scared people. When you bring this holistic vision to people of this so-called shamanistic vision to people of life, this tapestry, which many traditions in their best days assert, what has been the response from people, from students, to your work? People that have had this consciousness awakened in them.
I want to start by going back to what you said. I think the idea of worth or worthiness, feeling worthy, is very much connected to the way reality, or the way the narrative has been put out there. The narrative that if you do not earn particular income bracket, if you don't live in a particular neighborhood, if you don't have particular material things, it's like you don't matter. Your
Mhm.
ideas, your thinking does not matter. And so it directly connects with how much people choose to know about the system we find ourselves in. I think if people do not think it is in their interest to educate themselves, because I think that is important, to have adult learners who have the capacity to research for themselves and make up their own minds about what is true and what is false, because it also takes us away from the idea of just following dogma or just following others because it seems better. A big part of my work is based on experience. You'll know that most indigenous traditions were transmitted orally, so our education was very much practical, very much oral, through our proverbs, through just how we related with each other, elders and younger people, through the different tasks people have that would often be connected to their developmental age or stage, in their lives. So that is how our education was structured. It was very much fluid. It had to do a lot with your own developmental stage and the roles in which you will have to play a part in your community, in your family. So it was not necessarily about getting a job, which goes back to why people are so fragmented from their reality, because from 9 to 5 p.m., you are supposed to be this, and only think about this and only be productive. And when you become unproductive, we'll see it with how elderly people are treated in the Western culture. Elderly people are taken to old age homes. It's like you are discarded because you are no longer useful. Whereas in indigenous traditions, the older you become, it is assumed that you become wise. And therefore, you become even more treasured because you have wisdom to share with those who are still coming. So you'll see the contrast just in terms of how we think about the cycle of life. Beginnings and endings, what they symbolize, what they mean in the indigenous and non-indigenous worldviews. So I believe that it is all our responsibility to reflect and to research our life experiences so that the things we share with our children, with those who come after us, especially if we are professional educators, that we are sharing from lived experience, not only necessarily from the book, because we know that books are written by people and books inherently carry a particular bias because it's an idea and people want their ideas to be bought, because ideas that are bought are capital. They work to keep power in place or they work to challenge power. And that is the reality of it. So when we are able to encourage more people to research their own positionality and their own subjectivity in the world, then we'll be able to create or develop competent human beings to respond to the polycrisis we find ourselves in. Because if you are going to research what it means to be materially wealthy, and whether that connects with being a responsible human being or being compassionate, we'll see that it does not necessarily correlate. So access to money does not necessarily mean being a responsible human being. With all the things that are happening in the US and the exposés, the Epstein files, we are seeing that some of the people who hold the world's power are some of the sickest people we can find in the world. And so we need to then have the capacity to question what it means to be in power, what it means to have money, if it means you don't have class. Because they are the elite economically, but if we are going to associate money with class, then these people do not have class that are doing all these things. So for me, our sense of our ability to prove or disprove our experiences enables us to become scientists in our own spaces. because then as an individual, I need to go think about my experiences as an African woman in Africa, who's experienced a whole lot of domination in different ways, why my experiences are this, and then situate them within a broader reality or a framework to begin to question some of my own lived experience and to make sense of these things. And so that is what Conscious Conversations is about. Through Conscious Conversations, my intention and my aim is to create a global educational platform that focuses on theory and lived experience. So how are we able to connect our lived experience to create knowledge by using theory? And I think the more we are able to do that, the more we are able to create an education that has got the capacity to develop awakened learners, lifelong learners, or more aware lifelong learners, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And before we bring the bird down and learn what you have coming up with any publications or podcast themes or whatever the case may be, humanist and literary aficionado that I pretend to be, I would, if people want to have a very interesting meditation on, the sorrow of placing a job and placing a career at the center of one's life and finding one's personal worth in such. We're quickly losing a lot of our own culture here in America because of the technology. It's very, very short attention span. There was a book, even when I was a boy, that was taught. It was a play called The Death of a Salesman. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, Death of a
No,
Salesman, Mmabatho?
no, I
No?
haven't.
The author was Arthur Miller, who was married to Marilyn Monroe for a second there. He's buried down the road. I was shocked when I found that out. Arthur Miller is just buried maybe 10 minutes from here in Roxbury. But anyway, Death of a Salesman, I would recommend to a real meditation on the sorrow that comes with pinning your worth as an individual on your productivity in this market. Because this market, and I don't care if it's good or bad or whatever, it's going to chew you. It does not care about you whatsoever. And it's just as false, not even the stock market, the whole darn economy is just as false as the educational system. And that's a whole other discussion there. But I would bring that to people's attention because it really is worth pondering what, to Mmabatho's whole work, what is the point of all this? What are we doing here? And there are dead ends, and sometimes art can, very gently point out why certain things are dead ends. So Death of a Salesman is worth pursuing. I will put that down below. That text. I will put Patrick Pierce's text, The Murder Machine. Certainly Mmabatho's will be on top of both of those. People will check that out. And at the very bottom, there will be ApocatastasisI's website. But Mmabatho, when we do go to your website and when we do contact you with different correspondence related to your work and whatnot, what have you coming up? What have you been working on in terms of topics, and what can we look out for from you coming up?
I mean, I think I'd like to respond to what you've just shared now. I
Yes.
think how we understand our worth is so important, and that is a deeply spiritual thing or meditation. I believe that my values, so I'm very values driven, my values. So when I say I'm a trustworthy person, I'm a compassionate person, I'm kind, I want these values to actually mean something, not to someone else, firstly, but to myself. I think the relationship we individually have with our conscience is more important than anything, because it is your values that will anchor you when you need to make ethical decisions, right? So when you are between being homeless and between taking a check that comes from a source has harmed people, it is your conscience that will determine what you do. Many teachers that I follow, women like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Bell Hooks, who have informed a big part of my outlook, particularly in literature, in education, in the arts. They all say, you know, when you do this work of remembering who we are, we need to know that there is no, we should not expect an external reward, meaning you should not do it because you think you're going to make money. You should do it because it's the right thing to do and because it feeds your soul. So, worthiness or having a sense of self-worth and the work we produce is very important. It's very important that people understand why they do the things they do. If we do them because we are hoping to become wealthy, then that is problematic, because how many other things will we do to become wealthy? You know, so for me, my values are a big anchor for me. And I think wanting to cultivate the inner resources that help me to be in ethical relationship with all of life, then help me to make choices and to keep on doing what I feel called to do, even when the monetary exchange is not there. Because for me, the work exceeds what I'm able to gain in monetary, ways. Um, I'll be speaking at a conference organized by the Qualitative Report. It's a journal. I think it is on the 23rd of March, which is great. I can share that with you later, and you can include it if you want to. And then, yeah, I think people must just look forward to what's happening on Conscious Conversations. We've just ended season 4, and I've got some exciting ideas coming up in terms of collaborations. I think it's important to also have a practice, you know, so how can education become practical? How can it be action informed? You know, another difference between indigenous and non-indigenous worldview is that for us, from an indigenous perspective, a lot of what we do is practical. So if you cannot demonstrate it, it means you don't know it. And that ties back to our experiences. So having the capacity and the skill set to be able to put into practice some of the things I'm talking about, whether it's through a community of practice, whether it is through writing, but in what ways can I come up with creative projects that involve community, you know, to strengthen my work. Yeah, so there'll be lots coming up soon.
Excellent. So the audience is well advised to check out Mmabatho's website and to follow up on those very valuable podcasts. I've enjoyed a number myself already. And also there are ways to donate on her site, and that's part of the practicality of things. We can have all these great ideas, but I'll be a bit blunter than Mmabatho. There's also a stage. There's also a stage of maturity that people have, and it really is appreciated when people show that in material means to further Mmabatho's work here, there, and everywhere. In Africa, here in North America, who knows where she'll be showing up next. So anyway, to the audience, there you go. Thank you for your due diligence. Mmabatho, thank you especially for hanging out with us and telling us a lot about your work. We hope to have you down the line again.
Thank you so much, John, for having me. It's been great being in conversation with you, and I look forward to further engagements.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, over and out.